All right, welcome to this portion of the training. I'll be talking about the history, features, and purpose of applied behavior analysis. These are the task list items and test content that will be covered in this portion of the training. So what is applied behavior analysis? Although most people would consider applied behavior analysis, or ABA, as a therapy, it's much more detailed and nuanced than that. Applied behavior analysis is actually one of the three branches of behavior analysis. The other two being behaviorism, which is the philosophy of the science of behavior, and the experimental analysis of behavior, which is a natural science approach for discovering orderly and reliable relations between behavior and various types of environmental variables of which it is a function. Now, applied behavior analysis, more specifically as a science, is a systematic approach to understanding behavior of social importance. ABA is deeply rooted in the influential work of individuals like Edward Thorndike, John Watson, Ivan Pavlov, B.F. Skinner, just to name a few, although there's many that have contributed to applied behavior analysis as a science as well as a practice. Speaking of, as a practice, applied behavior analysis is the application of behavior analytic principles to improve socially important behaviors, which is probably a lot of what you'll be experiencing as a registered behavior technician. The birth of applied behavior analysis is commonly correlated with this publication, Some Current Dimensions of Applied Behavior Analysis, which was published by Beowulf and Risley, these men seated here. The 7 dimensions that they outline in this paper are commonly called the dimensions, although I think it's important to note that they said some current dimensions, not the dimensions. And there's been some papers and other individuals that have discussed adding to these dimensions, which I think is a very important thing to consider. But I'll dive deeper into each of these 7 dimensions now. So the applied dimension. Beowulf and Risley outlined the applied dimension as within behavioral application, the behavior, stimuli, and/or the organism under study are chosen because of their importance to man and society rather than their importance to theory. That's what distinguishes applied behavior analysis from the experimental analysis of behavior. It's important to consider what makes something applied and applied to who, and what makes something important or important to who. The primary question here is the evaluation in applied research is how immediately important is the behavior or these stimuli to this participant, and that's something important to consider within practice. How important is what you're doing currently, how immediately important is it to the behavior of the person or the client with whom you're working with? The behavioral dimension was outlined by Beowulf and Risley as in applied behavior analysis, we study what subjects can be brought to do rather than what they can be brought to say, unless, of course, a verbal response is the behavior of interest. This commonly requires precise measurement, but it's important to consider how we decide whose behavior is changed. But it's also more important to consider we're very interested in changing behavior, not just you being able to say that your behavior has been changed. So a participant's or a client's verbal description of their own behavior usually wouldn't be accepted as a measure within applied behavior analysis, unless we're more interested in changing how people talk about things, which typically isn't what we do. But the relevant question here is not what someone can be brought to say, but what someone can be brought to do. So again, the behavioral dimension, as Beowulf and Risley outlined, is we're more interested in what people can do as opposed to what they can say about what they do. The analytic dimension, as outlined by Beowulf and Risley, requires a believable demonstration of the events that can be responsible for the occurrence or the non-occurrence of the target behavior or the behavior of interest. In this instance, an experimenter has achieved an analysis of behavior when they can exercise control over it. This is more common, and I should have pointed out that these dimensions more closely relate to research and the application of research within the field, less or so applied to practice, although they can be considered within practice, which is also something important to consider. But we might be a little bit more lax in the analytic dimension in practice than we would be in the experimental analysis of behavior or research that would be considered applied behavior analytic. Because what's important here is, can we show that there's a reliable demonstration that the independent variable was responsible for changes in the dependent variable. So is our intervention actually responsible for the changes that we're seeing? In practice, that might mean a little bit less because we just want to make sure that the changes that we're seeing are important to the client. And it might matter a little bit less within practice what was responsible for that change, as long as the change is important for the client. But if you want to be a great clinician, you're probably going to be really interested in why that change occurred. So it's important to consider what makes a believable demonstration. What makes a believable demonstration in research is going to be much different than what makes a believable demonstration in practice. But this commonly comes down to experimental designs, which we'll talk about in great detail in later components of this training. But in those instances, we're interested in exercising control over the environment or control over the behavior. Some consider this turning the behavior on and off. When we can reliably turn behavior on and off, we've demonstrated the analytic dimension as outlined by Beowulf and Risley. The next dimension is technological. Beowulf and Risley talked about this as simply as the techniques have been described in a way and identified in a way that someone else could implement those procedures if they have similar training. So what this means is, have I described the intervention in a way that another RBT or another behavior analyst could be able to pick up and implement it in the exact same way that you had intended or that had been designed in that study. This, again, becomes really important within research, but also important in practice. And oftentimes, you're given some type of behavior intervention plan or some type of an intervention that has been described, and you, as the RBT, are going to be expected to implement it the way in which it was designed and written. So it's important to think about what makes a good definition of the behavior of interest and what's a good description of the intervention. And we'll talk about that more in later components of this training. Conceptual systems is the next dimension that Beowulf and Risley outlined, in which published descriptions of procedures are not only precisely technological, but also strive for relevance to principle. And what this means is we can understand exactly why the intervention was effective at doing what it did. We can tie it back to the behavioral principles that we know and have been discovered either in applied behavior analytic research or the experimental analysis of research. But we're tying this back into our behavioral understanding of why people do what they do. And this is important because if we don't tie it back to the behavioral strategies and the behavioral principles for why we know people do what we do, Beowulf and Risley said this could have the effect of making a body into just a collection of tricks. So we just have a bag of tricks that we could pull out as opposed to understanding why those interventions actually work. The dangers of having just a bag of tricks and not knowing why your intervention is going to work is we start to blame those interventions or the principles for not working or working and not understand exactly why they wouldn't be working. So if all you have is a hammer, you think that you can treat everything with a hammer. You can't really do that. But if you know why a hammer works and when a hammer works, then you know when to use a hammer versus a different tool that might be in your toolbox. So it's very important that we understand exactly why the interventions that we're using work. And that's the conceptual systems dimension that have been outlined by Beowulf and Risley. The second to last dimension that they outlined in this seminal paper was effective. And this is the application of behavioral techniques. Did it produce a large enough effect for practical value? If not, then the application has failed. So basically, was the intervention effective or not? Did it produce a change that's of importance and practical value for the client? What they didn't talk about here was what constitutes effective. Ultimately, that's a subjective claim and might vary from context to context and client to client. But when we evaluate whether an application has produced enough behavioral change to deserve the label of effective, a pertinent question might be, how much did that behavior need to be changed? And obviously that's not a scientific question, but it's a practical one. And its answer might be supplied by the people who interact with that behavior. So changing a grade from a C to a C+, we might not necessarily consider that effective. Changing a grade from a C to a B, we might consider that effective. But what will ultimately determine the level of effectiveness and if it was of enough practical value to be labeled effective will be determined by the consumers or the clients or the people that interact with the client. The last dimension that Beowulf and Risley outlined was generality. And this is if a behavioral change is prove to be durable over time. And if it appears in a wide variety of possible environments or contexts, and it spreads to a wide variety of related behaviors. So we say that our intervention has generality when we see that behavioral change in one context generalized to another context that without specific programming. It's difficult to define generality, and we'll talk in much more detail in later components of this training about generality, how to program for generalization, and how we get to generalization, how we ensure that generalization occurs. But the important point to consider here with respect to generality is it doesn't happen magically. Generalization should be programmed for rather than just expected. And so within our interventions, we do certain things to help ensure generality. And again, we'll talk in more detail about generality later on. So I'd like to shift a little bit to talk about the history of applied behavior analysis. And sometimes people roll their eyes when they think about history. I really enjoy history. I'm not necessarily a history buff, but I really enjoy learning about the history of applied behavior analysis because I think it's important to know about our history so we don't make the mistakes that have happened in our history. And there's a long history of applied behavior analysis, and I can't get into a lot of it here, but I'll try to give at least a bit of a sample. And if you don't believe me, let me appeal to some authorities here. So in this picture, there's some titans of the applied behavior analysis industry or as a science. And this quote comes from an Ed Morris paper, who I would consider the biggest historian within applied behavior analysis. And he makes some important points here about why it's important to know about our history. One is, again, we want to prevent repeating our same errors in the past. And if you look at the field today, you can see some errors that have occurred in the past that are continuing to occur. And I'd contend that's probably because we put less effort on educating up-and-coming behavior analysts or RBTs about the history of behavior analysis. And it's also important to know about the history of behavior analysis so we can examine the origins and the developments of where the problems or the errors might have occurred. Now, I won't read you each one of these, but I'll highlight them for you. And this might not be super convincing to you about why it's important to know the history. And again, I can't cover the entire history of behavior analysis within even a 40-hour training. If we dedicated this entire training to the history of behavior analysis, I still couldn't go over everything that has happened in our history. But I hope that at least I can engender some type of an interest for you to seek an understanding and dive deep into our history outside of this training and as you continue on in our field, hopefully beyond just the RBT credential. But again, I can just provide a sample, and what I'm going to provide is just some important historical events and people in applied behavior analysis. Oftentimes when you hear applied behavior analysis and the history of a behavior analysis, people just talk about B.F. Skinner. And I can't underscore the important contributions that he's provided, and the field might not be where it is today without his contributions, but there are also some historical antecedents to even his work that I think are important to note. So Edward Thorndike, some of his contributions were the law of effect, learning curves, the law of recency, trial and error learning, and that all mammals learn in a similar manner. And so you can see that some of these were necessary for Skinner to be able to do some of the things that he did and discover some of the things that he discovered. Without some of these things, without an understanding that all mammals learn in a similar manner, we wouldn't be able to do some of the things that we were able to do, and Skinner wouldn't have been able to discover some of the things that he was able to discover. Now again, I don't have the time to dive into each one of these because we just don't have that much time within the 40 hours, but I encourage you to look up some of these and to educate yourself on some of these, and not necessarily listen to what other people might say about Edward Thorndike and his contributions, but really go to the source materials with all of these things, as it's important to contact the source materials when you're interested in something like the history of applied behavior analysis. The next person that I'd like to point out is Ivan Pavlov. I'm sure some of you might have seen some of the memes that float around, like Ivan Pavlov, does that name ring a bell? Probably because some of his classical conditioning work where bells were conditioned to elicit salivation with dogs. Also important to note, it didn't start with a bell, it actually started with a metronome. So again, some of those fun little anecdotes that you can find out when you dive deeper into the history of behavior analysis. But some of the contributions that Ivan Pavlov can be responsible for that we can at least say we wouldn't have without some of his contributions are classical conditioning, other types of conditioning like forward conditioning, delay conditioning, trace conditioning, and and some of the earliest work in systematic desensitization. And we'll dive a lot deeper into systematic desensitization and some of the later components of this training. But just some of the contributions that we can contribute to Ivan Pavlov. Next is John B. Watson, who's typically considered the father of behaviorism, as well as conditioning emotional responding. And he really focused psychology on behavior instead of consequences, and had some of the earlier analyses of behavior, or of language from a behavior analytic perspective that Skinner really ran with and provided a more complete understanding of language from a behavioral perspective. But without some of John B. Watson's early contributions, I don't know that we would have gotten to where we got without him. You might see some quotes from John B. Watson that are typically taken out of context. One is, give me a dozen infants and I can turn them into anything. I'm paraphrasing there. But the next part of that quote says he admits himself he's going beyond the data at the time. But a lot of people at his time were going beyond the data. And he was using that to illustrate that point, that we really need data. We really need an analysis of behavior with repeated measures that we couldn't do with consciousness. So we focus psychology on behavior, which allows repeated measurements so we can have some of the things that we have today. And of course, like I said, B.F. Skinner, there's probably more contributions than I could probably fit on a slide. But just really focus on the selection of consequences at 3 different levels: operant, responding. So selection at the level of the individual, selection at the level of language, and selection at the level of culture. Satiation, deprivation, shaping, the analysis of verbal behavior, cultural selection. Again, I can't dive into all of the contributions of B.F. Skinner, but they're sown throughout this entire presentation, this entire training. But I encourage you to dive deep and read some of his work from the source, as opposed to people talking about some of the things that he has done, because we tend to lose things with secondhand descriptions. So just a fun little thing here, because I think a lot of people that get into the field tend to work with a particular clientele. Most of the time autistics are individuals diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, but applied behavior analysis has done an awful lot of things. So you can see along here anxiety, thumb sucking, emotions, breast cancer, energy conservation, stuttering, just to name a few. And what's interesting to see here is the year in which these have happened. 1941 for anxiety, thumb sucking in 1962. And I'll just continue to go on through here. You can see how early these dates are, as well as the citation that's provided here. If you're interested in learning any more about any of these studies, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to share them to help you continue your education in behavior analysis and dive deeper into the field than what is typically occurring. But you can see food selectivity was happening as early as 1959. So a lot of people think some of these things are newer contributions or newer areas in which applied behavior analysis is dived into, but we've been doing this stuff for a pretty long time. You just have to dive into the history to see it. In fact, Heward and colleagues in 2022 just published a paper about ABA from A to Z and 350 different domains of socially significant behavior in which applied behavior analysis has explored. And I won't dive into each one of these areas, but I really want to show it to you from A to Z. So there's A and B, and you can see just if we look at A and B, applied behavior analysis has contributed a lot to a lot of different areas within the society of socially significant behaviors. Starting with C, caffeine. D, drugs, dental work. There's so many different areas in which applied behavior analysis has shown that our science can be effective. Dyslexia, dressing, exercise, fake news, probably something that more and more people are hearing about today. Gambling, gerontology, gun safety, gymnastics. There's just so many different areas. I encourage you to contact this paper or to slow down this presentation so you can see some of these different areas. Impulsivity, hygiene, so many different important areas. Laundry, legal decision making, logic, lying, nail biting, music, motor tics. I said nail biting already. Sorry, I just get excited when I see this stuff because look at all of these different areas in which applied behavior analysis has shown that our science can be helpful in improving the lives of the people who contact our interventions. Schedule following, sales, school attendance, schizophrenia, so many, substance abuse, suicide, supported employment, urban search and rescue, toilet training. The list just goes on and on. Yelling, yoga. I know a lot of people are very interested in yoga. Applied behavior analysis even has something to contribute in that area, and zoo and aquarium management. So that's really the A to Z in the history of applied behavior analysis. And I hope, again, that this encourages you to dive a little bit deeper into understanding applied behavior analysis, the history of applied behavior analysis, and just diving into a deeper understanding of why we do what we do and who we can help. Thank you. That concludes this portion of the training.